Behind me is the Harlan County Courthouse. In 1943, Marshals hanged Jacob Hoskins from an oak tree here for stealing a mine payroll he never touched. His 19-year-old nephew, Elias, watched it happen.
He vanished for 50 years after butchering 20 marshals, who hanged his uncle at the courthouse. For 50 years, they searched for the man who had butchered 20 federal marshals in the months following his uncle's public execution. They called him the Phantom of Harlan County, a specter who had killed without leaving a single piece of evidence that investigators could follow, who had vanished so completely that some believed he had never existed at all. But the Phantom was not supernatural. He was a man named Isaiah Combs, and he had been watching from the mountains the entire time, waiting for death to reunite him with the uncle who had raised him, and whose murder he had avenged with methods that the civilized world could not comprehend. This is the true story of the most patient killer in Appalachian history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Harlan County, Kentucky, in the heart of the eastern coalfields, during the turbulent years of the late 1930s, when federal authority clashed with mountain traditions in ways that would leave scars across generations. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before the Revolutionary War, who considered themselves citizens of the mountains before they were citizens of any nation that claimed dominion over them. You see, in Harlan County during the years of our story, the tension between federal authority and local tradition had reached a breaking point. The government had been expanding its reach into regions that had governed themselves for over a century, imposing laws and regulations that mountain families considered illegitimate intrusions on their way of life. The federal marshals who enforced these new authorities were seen not as representatives of justice, but as invaders, outsiders who sought to destroy customs and traditions that the mountain people had no intention of abandoning. The man at the center of our story was born Isaiah Combs in 1915, in a cabin that overlooked the hollow where his family had lived since 1805. His parents had died when he was 3 years old, victims of the influenza epidemic that swept through the mountains in 1918, leaving him an orphan in a world that offered few protections to children who had lost their families. That's right. Isaiah Combs had known loss from his earliest memories, had experienced the absence of parents before he was old enough to understand what parents were supposed to provide. He might have been absorbed into an orphanage or distributed among relatives who viewed him as burden rather than blessing. Instead, he was taken in by his uncle, a man named Ezekiel Combs, who would become everything that a father should be, and whose death would transform Isaiah into something that the world would fear. Ezekiel Combs was 40 years old when he took in his brother's orphaned son, a bachelor who had never married and who had expected to live out his days alone in the cabin where he had been born. He was a mountain man in the truest sense, knew every ridge and hollow within 20 miles of his home, could survive in wilderness, that would have defeated people with more formal education but less practical knowledge. He had fought in the Great War, had returned with skills and experiences that he never spoke of, but that had left marks on his soul that observant people could see. The relationship that developed between uncle and nephew was something that exceeded what either of them had expected. Ezekiel, who had never imagined himself as a father, discovered capabilities for love and patience that surprised him. Isaiah, who had lost everything before he could remember having it, found in his uncle the stability and guidance that every child requires. They became not merely relatives, but companions whose bond was forged through years of shared labor and shared lives. Ezekiel taught Isaiah everything he knew about surviving in the mountains. He taught him to track game through forest that others found impenetrable, to shoot with accuracy that exceeded most men twice his age, to read the signs that the wilderness provided to those who knew how to interpret them. He taught him the history of the Combs family, the generations who had occupied these hollows since before Kentucky was a state, the obligations that each generation owed to ancestors who had cleared and settled this land. But most importantly, Ezekiel taught Isaiah about justice. The uncle had seen injustice in the war, had watched officers sacrifice enlisted men for objectives that served ambition rather than strategy, had returned with a conviction that the powerful would always abuse the powerless unless consequences existed to restrain them. He taught Isaiah that true justice was not what courts provided, but what conscience demanded, that a man who witnessed wrong and did nothing was complicit in the wrong he had witnessed. "The law serves those who write it," Ezekiel told Isaiah during one of the conversations that shaped the boy's understanding of the world. "It protects the powerful and punishes the weak." Real justice comes from men who are willing to act when the law fails, who are willing to accept consequences that acting requires. Remember that, boy. When the time comes, and it will come, remember that justice is not given. It is taken by those with the courage to take it. Isaiah grew into a man whose appearance concealed capabilities that few people suspected. He stood 6 feet tall by his 18th birthday, had dark hair and eyes that were the blue of deep water, possessed a stillness that some people found calming and others found unsettling. He was 23 years old in the autumn of 1938 when the events that would transform him from mountain farmer to mass murderer began to unfold. The trouble that would destroy everything Isaiah loved began with the federal government's decision to enforce prohibition with renewed vigor in regions that had traditionally been left to their own devices. The Volstead Act was in its final years, would be repealed before the consequences of its enforcement in Harlan County had fully played out, but the damage it would cause in these mountains would echo for generations. A federal marshal named Vernon Crawford was assigned to lead enforcement operations in the region, a man whose zeal exceeded anything the mountains had previously experienced. Crawford had built his career on aggressive tactics that produced impressive statistics, numbers that his superiors valued more than the human cost required to achieve them. He arrived in Harlan County with a mandate to demonstrate that federal authority could reach even the most remote hollows, that no tradition was old enough to justify defiance of laws that the government had determined to enforce. Ezekiel Combs operated a small still that produced whiskey for family use and occasional trade with neighbors, a practice that his father had taught him and that his grandfather had taught his father. The operation was modest, produced perhaps 20 gallons a month, provided income that supplemented what the small farm could not supply. It was illegal under the Volstead Act, but it was no different from what hundreds of other families throughout the mountains continued to do despite federal prohibition. Crawford identified Ezekiel as a target, not because his operation was significant, but because his defiance was visible. The uncle had spoken publicly against federal interference in mountain traditions, had organized meetings where families discussed resistance to enforcement that they considered illegitimate. He had become a symbol of opposition that Crawford determined to destroy, a demonstration target whose elimination would send a message throughout the region. The raid on the Combs property came on the morning of September 15, 1938. Crawford led 20 marshals up the mountain, with equipment that suggested their intentions went beyond simple arrest, with preparations that indicated the operation had objectives that exceeded any legitimate purpose. They came expecting resistance, hoping for resistance, prepared for a confrontation that would justify whatever followed. Isaiah was away from home that morning, had traveled to Virginia to purchase supplies that could not be obtained locally. Crawford had known about his absence. The raid had been timed specifically to ensure that only Ezekiel would be present, that the nephew whose capabilities Crawford had been warned about would not be there to complicate the operation. Ezekiel did not resist. He understood what was happening when he saw the force that Crawford had assembled, understood that resistance would provide justification for violence that might otherwise require explanation. He surrendered peacefully, allowed himself to be handcuffed without struggle, expected that he would be transported to a courthouse where legal proceedings would determine his fate. He was wrong about what Crawford intended. The marshals did not transport Ezekiel to a proper court. They took him instead to the Harlan County Courthouse, but not to face a judge who would hear evidence and render a verdict according to law. They took him to the courthouse square, where a crowd had been assembled to witness something that Crawford had been planning for weeks. A gallows had been constructed during the night, a wooden structure that stood in the center of the square where everyone could see it. The construction was crude but adequate, a platform with a trapdoor and a crossbeam from which a noose hung with patience that suggested it had been waiting for this moment. The gallows was not a permanent feature of Harlan's public square. It had been built specifically for this occasion, for this man, for this demonstration of federal power. The crowd that had gathered numbered in the hundreds, drawn from throughout the county by word that Crawford had spread through channels that ensured attendance would be noted. Miners stood beside their families, merchants beside their customers, children beside parents who would later wish they had not brought them. The atmosphere was not festive but was charged with tension that everyone could feel, a collective awareness that something terrible was about to occur. Crawford had positioned himself on a platform adjacent to the gallows, a location that allowed him to observe and be observed, to serve as master of ceremonies for the spectacle he had arranged. He wore his finest uniform, had polished his badge until it gleamed in the morning sun, had prepared remarks that he believed would cement his authority throughout the region. "Citizens of Harlan County," Crawford announced, his voice carrying across the square with the confidence of a man who believed himself beyond any consequence. "You have gathered to witness justice being administered to a criminal who has defied federal law, who has corrupted your communities with illegal whiskey, who has organized resistance to legitimate authority. Today that defiance ends." The charges were read, a litany of accusations that those who knew Ezekiel recognized as exaggerations at best and fabrications at worst. Illegal manufacture of alcohol, conspiracy against the United States, incitement to rebellion. Each charge was more extreme than the last, painted a picture of a dangerous criminal that bore no resemblance to the quiet farmer who stood in chains on the platform. Ezekiel was given an opportunity to speak, a mockery of due process that Crawford included to provide the appearance of legitimacy. The prisoner looked out at the crowd, at faces he recognized from a lifetime of living in these mountains, at neighbors and friends and people he had thought would stand with him if the time ever came. "I have committed no crime that any honest court would recognize," Ezekiel said, his voice steady despite the noose that weighted inches from his face. "I have made whiskey as my father made whiskey, as his father made whiskey before him. The law that condemns me was passed by men who know nothing of our traditions, enforced by men who care nothing for our welfare. What happens here today is not justice, it is murder, dressed in the clothing of authority. And those who participate in it, those who stand and watch without protest, will answer for what they have witnessed. If not in this life, then in whatever judgment awaits beyond." The crowd remained silent. No one spoke in Ezekiel's defense. No one challenged the proceedings. No one acknowledged the truth that his words contained. The power that Crawford represented was too great to challenge, the consequences of resistance too severe to risk. The crowd that might have saved Ezekiel chose instead to watch him die. The noose was placed around his neck with ceremony that suggested ritual rather than execution. Crawford personally adjusted the rope, ensured that it was positioned precisely as he wanted, tested the trapdoor mechanism with care that indicated the importance he placed on the details. The preparations took several minutes, each one adding to the tension that had built throughout the morning. "Let this be a lesson to anyone who would defy federal authority," Crawford announced, his voice carrying satisfaction that decency should have prevented. "The law will be enforced. Those who resist will face consequences, and those consequences will be administered publicly so that everyone may see what happens to those who challenge the power of the United States government." The trap door opened. Ezekiel fell through the platform, his body dropping the distance that Crawford had calculated. The rope snapped taut, caught his weight, and the sound that followed was not the clean break that a proper execution would have produced. But the death was not instantaneous. Crawford had miscalculated, or perhaps had calculated correctly, for an outcome he desired. The drop was insufficient for a clean break, produced damage that was fatal, but not immediately so. The neck was injured, but not severed from the spine, created a situation where death would come but would take its time arriving. Ezekiel dangled from the rope for nearly 8 minutes, his body convulsing as life slowly departed, his legs kicking in patterns that varied from frantic to rhythmic to still. The rope creaked with each movement, a sound that carried across the silent square with clarity that made it impossible to ignore. The gallows itself swayed slightly, the wooden structure absorbing the energy of a man fighting against death that the rope was slowly delivering. His face changed colors as the minutes passed, progressed from red to purple to a gray-blue that indicated the final stages of asphyxiation. His eyes bulged from pressure that the constricted blood vessels created. remained open throughout the process in ways that witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. Those eyes seemed to move across the crowd, seemed to search for someone who might help, seemed to accuse everyone present of complicity in what was happening. His hands, bound behind his back, clenched and unclenched in patterns that reflected the body's desperate attempts to survive. His fingers grasped at air that offered no purchase, reached for salvation that was not available. The movement continued long after conscious thought had likely ceased, reflexes that the dying body produced without guidance from a mind that was already departing. Sounds emerged from Ezekiel's throat throughout the hanging, sounds that the crowd would never forget, regardless of how desperately they tried. The choking was constant, a wet gurgling that indicated the rope was crushing rather than breaking. Gasps that might have been attempts at words or might have been merely the body's reflexive search for air. Moans that seemed to carry messages that the crowd was not prepared to interpret. "He's looking at us," someone in the crowd whispered, loud enough for others to hear. "God help us, he's looking at us." The crowd watched in horror that their silence could not express. Some turned away, unable to witness what was happening, only to find that turning away did not block the sounds that continued for minutes, that seemed to stretch into hours. Others watched with expressions that showed they would never forget what they had seen. Faces that carried the knowledge that they had witnessed something that would mark them permanently. Children who had been brought to witness federal authority in action would carry nightmares for the rest of their lives, would wake screaming from dreams that reproduced the gallows with accuracy that their young minds could not escape. Parents who had brought them would spend years regretting a decision that had seemed reasonable when federal marshals had encouraged attendance, would watch their children suffer from trauma that no comfort could fully address. The final convulsion came at the 8-minute mark, a shudder that ran through Ezekiel's body from head to toe and then stilled into the absolute motionlessness that only death could produce. The legs stopped kicking, the hands stopped grasping, the sounds from his throat ceased. The eyes that had seemed to search the crowd for help remained open but saw nothing anymore. Crawford allowed the body to hang for a full minute after the movement stopped, ensuring that death was complete and that the display would achieve its maximum effect. The silence in the square was absolute, broken only by the creaking of the rope as it adjusted to the weight it now held permanently. "Justice has been served," Crawford announced, his voice carrying satisfaction that decency should have prevented. "Let this be a warning to anyone who would defy federal authority. The law will not tolerate those who resist its enforcement." When Ezekiel's body finally stilled, when the movement ceased and the death was complete, Crawford ordered the corpse left on the gallows for the remainder of the day. The display was intended as a warning, a message to anyone who might consider similar defiance. The body that hung in Harlan's Courthouse Square was an advertisement of power that would accept no limits. The crowd dispersed slowly, people moving away from the square with expressions that ranged from horror to shame, to something that might have been the first stirrings of rage. They had witnessed something that they knew was wrong, had stood by while it happened, had become complicit in murder that the law had authorized, but that no moral code could justify. Isaiah returned to Harlan County 3 days after his uncle's death, arrived to find a community that had been transformed by what it had witnessed. He learned what had happened from neighbors whose voices still trembled when they described the execution, from friends who could not meet his eyes as they recounted details that their consciences could not forget. He went to the cemetery where Ezekiel had been buried, stood at a grave that was still fresh, felt something change inside him that would not change back until 20 marshals were dead. The transformation was not dramatic, produced no visible alteration in his appearance or demeanor, but those who saw him in the days that followed would later recall that something in his eyes had shifted, had become something cold and purposeful and infinitely patient. He did not speak of revenge. He did not threaten or promise or reveal anything of what was forming in his mind. He simply went about the business of settling his uncle's affairs, of maintaining the property that had been left to him, of appearing to accept what could not be changed. The marshals who watched him, who expected some reaction that would justify additional action, saw nothing that alarmed them. They concluded that the nephew had accepted his uncle's fate, had learned the lesson that Crawford had intended to teach. They were catastrophically wrong. Isaiah spent 6 months preparing for what he intended to do. He gathered intelligence about the Marshals who had participated in his uncle's arrest and execution, learned their names and faces and routines through observation that they never detected. He compiled a list of 20 targets, memorized details that would allow him to find each one, regardless of where they might attempt to hide. He studied each Marshal with patience that exceeded anything they could have imagined, learned their habits and their vulnerabilities, identified the moments when each would be most accessible. He mapped their movements, noted their schedules, discovered the patterns that would allow him to predict where each would be at any given time. The preparation was meticulous, reflected training that Ezekiel had provided, and capabilities that the war had demonstrated were possible. He also prepared himself physically for what he intended to do. The strength he had developed through years of mountain labor was refined into capability more specific to his purpose. He practiced with weapons until accuracy became instinctive, trained his body to move through forest without leaving traces that could be followed, developed the patience that hunting required when prey could not be rushed. The first killing occurred on March 15, 1939, exactly 6 months after Ezekiel's execution. A marshal named Dale Tackett was found in his home, his body displaying wounds that suggested prolonged suffering before death finally came. The method was butchery, a cutting that had removed pieces while the victim still lived. That had demonstrated capabilities for inflicting pain that exceeded anything the investigators had encountered. The body had been discovered by Tackett's wife when she returned from visiting relatives, a homecoming that would haunt her for the rest of her days. What she found in the bedroom where her husband had been sleeping bore little resemblance to the man she had married. The cutting had been systematic, had followed patterns that suggested anatomical knowledge, had removed extremities and pieces of flesh in sequences that seemed designed to prolong consciousness as long as possible. On what remained of his chest, carved into flesh that had ceased to bleed, were the words, "For Ezekiel." The investigation that followed produced nothing useful. The killing had been conducted with skill that exceeded anything local law enforcement had encountered, had left no evidence that could identify the perpetrator. No fingerprints, no footprints that could be traced, no witnesses who had seen anything unusual. The killer had approached like a ghost, had conducted butchery that must have taken hours, had departed without leaving any indication of how he had come or gone. The connection to the Combs case was obvious, but the obvious suspect, the grieving nephew, had an alibi that witnesses confirmed and that investigators could not break. Isaiah had been seen in Virginia on the night of the killing, had multiple witnesses who could testify to his presence in locations far from Tackett's home. The investigators knew he was responsible, but could not prove what they knew. Isaiah had been careful. He had established his presence elsewhere through arrangements that multiple witnesses could verify, had created documentation of his location that investigation could not challenge. The killing had occurred during hours when Isaiah was supposedly miles away, confirmed by people whose testimony could not be questioned. The alibis were not accidents. They were the product of planning that had begun months before the first knife had touched flesh. The second killing came 3 weeks later, claiming Robert Lawson, another marshal who had been present at the execution. Lawson was found in circumstances that exceeded even Tackett's death in their horror. The butchery had been more extensive, had removed more pieces while the victim remained alive, had demonstrated that the killer was refining his methods with each application. Lawson had been found in a barn on his property, strung up from the rafters in a position that mimicked the hanging that had killed Ezekiel. But unlike Ezekiel, Lawson had not died from the rope. He had been cut while suspended, had watched pieces of himself being removed while he hung helpless, had experienced a death that combined the method of Ezekiel's execution with refinements that exceeded anything the uncle had suffered. The investigators who examined the scene noted that the cuts showed precision that suggested medical training or butchering experience. The removal of fingers had been methodical, each one taken at the knuckle with cuts that were clean rather than ragged. The removal of other pieces showed similar precision, suggested someone who understood how bodies were assembled and how they could be disassembled while maintaining consciousness. The pattern that would define the spring and summer of 1939 had been established. Isaiah was not merely killing the Marshals who had murdered his uncle. He was butchering them, was taking them apart piece by piece while they still lived, was ensuring that each death was worse than the death that had preceded it. That's right. Isaiah continued his campaign through the spring and summer, taking his targets with regularity that demonstrated patience and capability that investigators could not explain. The third killing came in April, the fourth in May, each displaying methods that exceeded what the previous deaths had shown, each leaving messages that identified the motivation but concealed the killer. The third victim had been found missing both hands and both feet, had been alive when they were removed, had bled to death over hours that must have been filled with agony that the investigators' reports could not fully convey. The fourth victim had been found with his eyes removed while still alive, had been blinded before the cutting began, had experienced what was done to him through senses other than sight. The fear that spread through the Marshal Service was unlike anything the region had experienced. Deputies who had participated in Ezekiel's execution began to understand that they were being hunted, that something was systematically butchering everyone who had been present that day in September. Some fled the county, hoping that distance would provide safety. Others demanded protection that the service struggled to provide. A few resigned entirely, deciding that no salary justified the risk of becoming the next victim. The service assigned guards to those who remained, established surveillance on the Combs property that continued for months without producing useful information. Isaiah was observed going about his daily business, maintaining the farm that Ezekiel had left him, appearing to live a life that was entirely ordinary. The watchers saw nothing that suggested he was responsible for killings that continued to occur while they observed him, deaths that happened in locations where their surveillance confirmed he was not present. The methods Isaiah employed reflected skills that his uncle had taught him, and that months of preparation had refined into something lethal. He moved through the forest without leaving traces that even experienced trackers could follow, approached his targets through routes that seemed impossible, struck at moments when his victims believed themselves safe. He had learned to create alibis that were unbreakable, to establish his presence in one location while conducting operations in another. The techniques involved networks of people who believed they were helping with ordinary matters, who provided testimony about Isaiah's presence without understanding what that testimony protected. He manipulated the world around him with subtlety that the investigators never detected, created realities that the evidence supported even though those realities were fabrications. The fifth and sixth killings came in June, taking marshals who had surrounded themselves with guards, who had fortified their homes, who had taken every precaution that seemed reasonable. None of the precautions proved adequate. Isaiah reached them anyway, conducted butchery that lasted hours while guards heard nothing that would have alerted them, departed leaving bodies that the guards discovered only when silence had lasted too long. The guards themselves became targets after the sixth killing, men who were found butchered in positions outside the properties they had been assigned to protect. The message was clear: protecting the marshals would not save those who provided the protection. No one was safe. No precaution was adequate. The killer could reach anyone, anywhere, and the butchery would continue until everyone on his list had experienced what they had helped inflict on Ezekiel Combs. Marshals who had fled to other states discovered that distance provided no protection. The seventh killing occurred in Virginia, the eighth in Tennessee, the ninth in West Virginia. Isaiah tracked them across state lines with persistence that the service had never encountered, reached targets who believed themselves far beyond any consequence of what they had done to a mountain farmer. The 10th through 15th killings cleared most of the remaining ordinary marshals, each death demonstrating capabilities that seemed to exceed what any single person could possess. The butchery grew more refined with each victim, showed knowledge of anatomy that prolonged suffering, revealed patience that allowed Isaiah to work for hours on targets who could not die until he permitted them to. The 16th and 17th killings took marshals who had been assigned to protect Crawford, men who were found in pieces directly outside the safe house where the supervisor was hiding. The attacks occurred without alerting Crawford himself, demonstrated that Isaiah could reach anyone, could penetrate any protection, could wait indefinitely for the moment when vulnerability appeared. Crawford attempted to flee on September 15, 1939, exactly 1 year after Ezekiel's execution. He had arranged transportation that he believed was secret, had planned a route that would take him far from Kentucky, and the vengeance that had claimed 17 of his men. He did not understand that Isaiah had been waiting for exactly this date, had positioned himself to intercept escape on the anniversary of the crime that had started everything. The confrontation occurred on a mountain road, where the terrain forced vehicles to slow, where the forest pressed close on both sides, where an ambush could not be avoided. Crawford's guards died first, killed in seconds by shots from positions they never identified. Then Crawford was alone, trapped in a vehicle that was going nowhere, facing a man who emerged from shadows that should have concealed nothing. "Do you remember Ezekiel Combs?" Isaiah asked, his voice carrying the flatness of someone for whom emotion had been replaced by purpose. "Do you remember hanging him in the courthouse square while a crowd watched? Do you remember how long it took him to die because you miscalculated the drop? Do you remember leaving his body on display for the rest of the day?" Crawford tried to speak, to offer explanations or bargains or anything that might delay what was clearly coming, but Isaiah had no interest in words, had not traveled this far and killed this many to be satisfied with anything except completion of the task he had set himself. What Isaiah did to Vernon Crawford during the 3 days before he finally died would be detailed in journals that would not be discovered for 50 years. The butchery exceeded anything the previous killings had demonstrated, removed pieces that Crawford watched being removed, kept the supervisor alive through procedures that should have killed him, but that Isaiah's skill prevented from being fatal until the time was right. "My uncle raised me from the time I was 3 years old," Isaiah told Crawford during the hours of cutting. "He was the only father I ever knew. He taught me everything I know about these mountains, everything I know about justice, everything I know about what men owe to other men. You took him from me. You hanged him in public while people watched. You made a spectacle of his death to demonstrate your power. Now you understand what power really means. Now you learn what happens when you murder men who have people who love them." Crawford's death came on the morning of September 18th, exactly 3 days after his capture, exactly 1 year and 3 days after Ezekiel's execution. The body that was eventually found, weeks later in a location so remote that only accident allowed its discovery, was barely recognizable as human, had been reduced to components that forensic investigators struggled to reassemble. The remaining Marshals, numbers 18 through 20, died in rapid succession during the final days of September. Isaiah no longer employed the extended butchery that Crawford had experienced, simply killed them with efficiency that suggested he was completing a task rather than extracting vengeance. The work was nearly done, and he had other purposes to prepare for. 20 Marshals, every lawman who had participated in Ezekiel's arrest and execution, every man who had helped construct the gallows or who had watched the hanging without protest. All of them dead now, all of them having experienced butchery that would haunt the dreams of investigators for generations, all of them having learned that the nephew they had dismissed as harmless was something that their experience had not prepared them to imagine. Isaiah Combs disappeared on October 1st, 1939, and did not emerge from the wilderness for 50 years. The mountains of eastern Kentucky became his sanctuary, terrain that he knew better than any map could document, that concealed him through decades of solitude that would have destroyed anyone with less purpose. He found a location that no search could discover, a hollow so remote that even the mountain families who lived nearby did not know of its existence. The entrance to his refuge was concealed by terrain that appeared impassable, a rockfall that blocked what seemed like the only route into the hollow. But Isaiah knew a different way, a path through the rocks that his uncle had shown him years before, a route that required knowledge passed down through generations and that no outsider would ever discover by chance. The path wound through crevices that seemed too narrow for human passage, required climbing and crawling, and movements that only someone who knew the exact sequence could perform. Beyond the rockfall, the hollow opened into a valley that seemed to exist in a different world from the one Isaiah had left behind. The walls rose steeply on all sides, creating natural barriers that no casual explorer would attempt to scale. A stream ran through the center, fed by springs that emerged from the rock face and that flowed year-round regardless of drought conditions that might affect the world outside. The floor of the hollow was covered with forest that had grown undisturbed for centuries, trees whose size suggested they had never known the axe. He built a cabin from materials the forest provided, using techniques that Ezekiel had taught him and that generations of Combs family members had refined. The construction took months during which he lived in shelters of branches and bark while the permanent structure took shape. He felled trees with an axe he had brought from the old homestead, shaped logs with patience that the work required, notched corners with joints that needed no nails and that would hold through decades of weather. The structure was positioned against a cliff face that provided one wall and protection from weather that might otherwise have made the location uninhabitable. The rock absorbed heat during sunny days and released it during cold nights, created a thermal mass that moderated temperatures inside the cabin throughout the year. He created a home that the wilderness concealed and that 50 years of solitary living would expand into something that exceeded mere shelter. Additional structures were added as years passed: a smokehouse for preserving meat, a root cellar dug into the hillside for storing vegetables through winters, a workshop where he could create tools and repair equipment. The complex that eventually surrounded his original cabin represented decades of continuous improvement, showed what determined labor could accomplish even in the most remote locations. The garden he established provided vegetables that supplemented the meat he obtained through hunting and trapping. The first garden failed almost entirely, planted in soil that proved too poor, and in locations that received insufficient sunlight. He learned from the failure, amended the soil with materials gathered from the forest floor, selected locations where gaps in the canopy allowed sunlight to reach the ground. Each subsequent year produced better results as his understanding of the conditions deepened. Potatoes became his staple, hardy enough to survive the conditions and nutritious enough to sustain him through winters that lasted 5 months. He grew varieties that Ezekiel had cultivated, seeds saved from the garden at the old homestead, connections to a past that he refused to entirely abandon. Beans and squash provided variety, stored well through the cold months, required less attention than crops that needed constant care. The hunting evolved over years into a system that produced reliable results with minimal effort. He learned the patterns of deer that populated the ridges around his hollow, identified the routes they traveled and the times they moved along those routes. He positioned himself accordingly during seasons when their meat was most valuable, took only what he needed, and preserved what he took with smoking and salting techniques that Ezekiel had taught him. He constructed traps that captured smaller game without requiring his presence, snares positioned along routes that rabbits and squirrels favored. The traps were checked daily during seasons when they were active, produced reliable harvests that supplemented the larger game, and provided variety that pure deer meat could not offer. The first years were consumed by a grief that the campaign of killing had delayed but not eliminated. The vengeance had provided purpose while it lasted, focus that prevented the full weight of his loss from crushing him. Now, with the killing done and nothing remaining to distract him, the grief arrived with force that nearly destroyed him. He grieved for Ezekiel in ways that the butchery had not allowed him to express. The uncle who had raised him, who had taught him everything he knew, who had been the only family he had ever really had. That man was gone, would never return regardless of how many Marshals Isaiah killed. The vengeance had been necessary, had satisfied something that demanded satisfaction, but it had not brought Ezekiel back, had not filled the emptiness that his absence had created. The first winter nearly killed him, not from cold or hunger, but from despair that made survival seem pointless. He would lie in his cabin for days at a time, unable to gather the motivation to eat or tend the fire or perform any of the tasks that survival required. The grief was a weight that pressed down on his chest, made breathing difficult, made every movement require effort that seemed disproportionate to any possible benefit. He spent months in states that alternated between catatonic stillness and fits of rage that sent him wandering through forest that absorbed his screams without response. He called for Ezekiel, held conversations with an uncle who could not respond, created a relationship with the dead that became more real than any connection to the living could have been. He heard Ezekiel's voice in his mind, imagined responses to questions he asked, maintained dialogue that the outside world would have called madness, but that Isaiah experienced as genuine connection. There were times when he considered ending his existence, when the weight of isolation seemed too heavy to carry. He would stand at the edge of cliffs that offered quick release, would hold weapons that could end his suffering in seconds, would imagine the reunion with Ezekiel that death might provide. The temptation was strongest in winter, when the cold seemed to penetrate everything, and the darkness lasted for 16 hours, and the isolation felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. One night during the third winter, he walked to the highest point in the hollow with his rifle and full intention of using it. He sat on a rock that overlooked the valley he had made his home, placed the barrel beneath his chin, and began to apply pressure to the trigger. The metal was cold against his skin, the darkness was absolute around him, and the release that death offered seemed like the only escape from pain that would not otherwise end. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was Ezekiel's voice in his mind, telling him that suicide would make the Marshals' victory complete, would mean that they had killed not just the uncle, but the nephew as well. Perhaps it was simply the stubbornness that had allowed him to kill 20 men without being caught, the same determination that refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed like relief. He lowered the rifle, sat in darkness until the urge passed, returned to the cabin with a resolve to continue, that he did not entirely understand, but that would sustain him through decades to come. The grief did not pass, but it transformed into something he could carry without being crushed. Ezekiel remained present in his existence, a companion whose voice he heard in his mind and whose presence he felt in moments of quiet that the forest provided. He spoke to his uncle daily, described his activities and asked for guidance that memory provided, maintained the relationship that death had interrupted but had not ended. He kept journals throughout his isolation, documented his days and thoughts in notebooks he made from materials the wilderness provided. The journals served multiple purposes. They provided activity that filled hours that might otherwise have been empty. They created a record that would eventually explain what had happened and why, and they maintained a connection to language and thought that pure solitude might otherwise have eroded. He wrote about Ezekiel constantly, preserved memories of the uncle who had raised him, and whose death had transformed his life into something unrecognizable. He described the lessons Ezekiel had taught, the skills he had passed on, the philosophy of justice that had guided Isaiah's campaign of vengeance. The writing kept Ezekiel alive in ways that memory alone could not accomplish. He told me that justice is not given but taken. Isaiah wrote in an entry from 1955, 16 years into his isolation. He told me that the powerful will always abuse the powerless unless consequences exist to restrain them. He told me that a man who witnesses wrong and does nothing is complicit in the wrong he has witnessed. I witnessed wrong, I did not do nothing. 20 men learned what consequences mean, and now I wait in the mountains that my uncle loved, until death reunites us in whatever place the dead inhabit. He wrote about the killings in detail that would eventually provide answers to questions that investigators had abandoned. Each death was described, each method was explained, each victim was identified with an account of his role in Ezekiel's execution. The journals were a confession that Isaiah intended to survive him, a truth that he believed the world should eventually know. I butchered 20 men, he wrote. I butchered them because they hanged my uncle in the courthouse square while a crowd watched. I butchered them because the law protected them and abandoned Ezekiel. I butchered them because vengeance was the only response available when every other avenue had been closed. I do not regret what I did. I would do it again, would do it with the same patience and the same methods if the circumstances required. The decades passed with rhythms that the seasons provided. He watched the world change from vantage points that allowed observation without detection. He saw roads improve and vehicles become more common, and aircraft appear in skies that had been empty when his isolation began. He observed the passing of years through changes that affected even his remote location, saw the world move forward while he remained anchored to a past that the present had forgotten. The investigation that had searched for him was abandoned by the 1950s. The case files closed with the notation that the perpetrator had likely died in the wilderness that concealed him. Isaiah observed the searches from concealment that they never penetrated, watched them give up one by one, understood that he had accomplished what his uncle's training had made possible. He had committed 20 murders and escaped any consequence except the solitude that his escape required. By the 1980s, Isaiah was in his 70s, had survived alone in the wilderness for more than 4 decades, had maintained his existence through capabilities that most people would have found impossible. The strength that had allowed him to butcher 20 marshals had long since faded, replaced by adaptations that intelligence and determination devised. He could no longer range as far from his cabin as survival had once required, could no longer hunt with the efficiency that younger years had allowed. He knew that his time was ending. The body that had served him through decades of solitary existence was finally surrendering to age that nothing could delay indefinitely. He prepared for death as he had prepared for everything else, with practicality that did not exclude reflection, with acceptance that did not preclude resistance. He wrote final entries in his journals, messages for whoever might eventually find his remains. He explained that the journals contained truth that he wanted known, that the mystery of the 20 marshals deserved resolution, that Ezekiel's murder should be remembered alongside the vengeance that had answered it. Isaiah Combs died in his cabin on November 15, 1989, at the age of 74. He had survived alone in the wilderness for 50 years, had maintained his existence through skills that most people had forgotten were possible, had carried his grief and his secret through decades that would have destroyed anyone with less determination. His body was found 3 years later by hikers who had ventured deeper into the mountains than anyone had explored in decades. They discovered the cabin he had built, the evidence of an existence that had persisted in isolation for half a century. The discovery was astonishing, suggested capabilities for survival that the modern world found almost impossible to believe. The journals were found beside his body, dozens of handmade notebooks that documented 50 years of isolation and that contained confessions to 20 killings that had never been solved. The investigators who eventually examined these materials found answers to questions that had baffled authorities for over 5 decades. The case files on the Harlan County Marshal killings were reopened, the new evidence examined with techniques that had not existed in 1939. The details matched perfectly. The victims, the methods, the timeline, everything that Isaiah had recorded corresponded to evidence that investigators had gathered 50 years before, but had never been able to connect to a suspect. The revelation produced headlines across the country. The story combined elements that fascinated the public: vigilante justice, impossible survival, decades of solitude, and truth that emerged only after everyone who might have been punished or vindicated was long dead. Investigators who examined the historical records discovered evidence that supported Isaiah's account of what had been done to Ezekiel. Documents were found that confirmed the execution had been extrajudicial, that confirmed Crawford had exceeded any legitimate authority in ordering a public hanging for crimes that did not carry capital punishment. The corruption that had enabled the murder was exposed alongside the vengeance it had provoked. The descendants of the Marshals learned that their ancestors had participated in the public hanging of a man whose only crime was making whiskey, as his ancestors had done for generations, had helped construct a gallows in the courthouse square, and had watched without protest while an innocent man died slowly because the drop had been miscalculated. Some families had suspected something like this, had preserved stories that hinted at shame rather than mere misfortune. Others had believed official accounts, had mourned ancestors as victims of violence that had no justifiable cause. The moral philosophers who examined the case debated whether Isaiah's actions could be justified. He had butchered 20 men over 6 months, had used methods that caused suffering that exceeded anything legitimate concepts of justice could encompass. The horror of what he had done was undeniable, but his uncle had been hanged in the courthouse square while a crowd watched and did nothing, had been murdered by men whose badges protected them from consequence. The nephew's vengeance had been the only response that circumstances allowed, the only justice that would ever be achieved for Ezekiel Combs. Isaiah was buried beside his uncle, in the cemetery where Combses had been laid to rest for generations. The graves bear inscriptions that the family considered appropriate. Ezekiel Combs, 1878-1938, hanged without justice, never forgotten. Isaiah Combs, 1915-1989. He loved his uncle. He avenged his uncle. He waited 50 years. The songs that emerged from the Isaiah Combs story were among the most powerful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of what was done to Ezekiel and the patience of the nephew who made 20 marshals pay. The first verse described Isaiah and Ezekiel, the orphan and the uncle who became his father, the bond that formed through years of shared life in the mountains. The melody was warm and protective, suggesting love that should have been allowed to continue. The second verse described the hanging, the courthouse square gallows, the crowd that watched without protest while a man died slowly because the drop had been miscalculated. The melody became something terrible, notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear. The third verse described Isaiah's transformation, the nephew who became something else when his uncle's body hung in the public square for a crowd's education. The melody grew cold and purposeful, suggesting calculation that had replaced feeling. The fourth verse described the campaign of butchery, the 20 marshals who fell one by one over 6 months, the phantom of Harlan County that no one could catch. The melody had an inexorable quality, suggesting fate that could not be escaped. The fifth verse described the 50 years of solitude, the man who became a ghost in mountains that had always been his home, the uncle who remained alive in memory long after the world had forgotten them both. The melody softened, became almost peaceful, suggesting existence that had found meaning in sacrifice that could not be measured. The final verse described the discovery and the truth that emerged, the confession that solved mysteries 5 decades old, the reunion in death that life had denied. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that patience, however painful, eventually receives its reward. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Isaiah and Ezekiel rest together at last, to read the inscriptions that promise nephew and uncle are finally reunited? Would you walk through the wilderness where Isaiah survived for 50 years? Would you try to understand how love could sustain a life that had lost everything except the memory of what it had once possessed? The journey to Harlan County is easier now than it was in 1938. The roads paved and the world more connected than it was when federal marshals hanged a man in the courthouse square for the crime of making whiskey. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of uncles and nephews rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of the man who vanished for 50 years after butchering 20 marshals who hanged his uncle at the courthouse. A story of love that became fury, that became decades of solitude, that ended only when death brought reunion that life had denied. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all. Thanks for listening to this story. And as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the nephews who call them home.